Hello, everyone, and welcome to this cert-manager bi-weekly meeting. Today is the 10th of August, and we have come together to talk about some of the items that we have on our calendar. Peter, you're the first one who has an item on the calendar, right?
I do.
Right.
Let me.
Go ahead.
Awesome. I will share my screen so it makes more sense what I am talking about. But I have too many windows open. Give me 2 seconds. Cert-manager bi-weekly. Share. Right, you can see meeting notes, yes? Yeah, cool. Yes. So I've recently done some work on this very old issue, which is affectionately named certificate presets. I apologize to Richard and Ash because they have heard me talk about this all week. But since it's quite a while ago that it was raised, I've tried to do some more in-depth investigation into what the actual what the real value is to this concept of having preset default or preset values for certificates in this HackMD article, which is linked in the latest comment. And I'm very much looking for feedback, things I've missed, other solutions that might apply. But really, I've tried to go over here what the issue or issues are, some potential use cases that might stretch beyond what an initial feature might look like, but there's some ideas there. What should be in scope and what shouldn't. Very specifically, this is about defaults and not policy. If you want policy, we have another project for that. And then going into what should be defaultable, what should never be defaulted, because it's very application specific. And then some potential solutions, either looking at a new CRD or a sub-field in the issuer spec. One of the main things I think I talk about is the idea of linking a preset to an issuer, in that an issuer that might make it simpler to implement. If you have multiple presets, I think someone else mentioned in the actual issue thread that if you have multiple presets, then you have inheritance and orders and things get a bit more complicated. Not undoable, but is there any value to having that available, basically? So yeah, there's some solutions to setting certificate values, such as like say like private key settings, for example, or like the subject field on the certificate. You might always want to default it to your organization's name. And then there's also the idea of setting a default issuer. So it's possibly as well as what we call a certificate preset, where you preset certificate values. There might be an issuer preset where you default the issuer by some means. My preference is per namespace, or a default cluster issuer or default namespace issuer. I think that covers the majority of cases, but very much looking for input from people where that might not be the case, as in what edge cases are we missing that we could fall down on later. Proposed solution, risks, and maybe some extensions of the feature. But yes, I thought I'd bring it up here in case some people wider from the community would like to input and kind of work out what the next direction is. I think my next step is to turn this into some sort of design document, which Mail has previously said he will try and help me do something like that. But yeah, that was the topic. I'll go back to the agenda.
Okay, great. Yeah, I have had less. This is the first time I'm seeing this proposal from you. I did hear from certificate presets before. And maybe just a quick question, and tell me if it's not like a useful question. Then I'll just shut up. But my question is, I guess currently there is already some defaulting in the issuer implementation. Like, for example, Vault or Venafi will default some of the fields of the certificates, or will just ignore even some of the requested fields. Like, you may say that I want to request a certificate with a certain organization in the subject, and then Venafi returns something with another organization, or Vault returns something with another organization. How does that relate to what you're doing?
Yes. So I think the main, I will answer that, but very quickly sidestep. So the main benefit to having these defaults is that basically an end user has to specify less YAML to get a certificate, because your user is usually either a tenant of a cluster, so having some default settings that they don't have to worry about or think about is useful, or they're a platform user who equally doesn't want to have to write lots of YAML and sets a preset once and then is kind of done with it. The idea of linking it to an issuer is exactly for the reason you said, is that an issuer, like, I think, but please correct me if I'm wrong here, but cert-manager does its best to make a certificate request that the issuer is going to accept, but the issuer can kind of do what it wants with that. So I think maybe one of the extension goals of this would be, in the future, would be, yes, you can set defaults, and ideally you would set those defaults to match your issuer, but maybe there's value to kind of reading those defaults in, as in asking the issuer, what's your default for, I don't know, this Venafi policy or this Vault policy? Like, what is the default set for the organization, blah, 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 blah. And so rather than having to specify the YAML, it would just be sort of visible, but yeah. And the other concern, I think one of the threads linked is around setting like revision history limit, and the default for that maybe isn't very sensible for a lot of people, but it was set for backwards compatibility. So there's allowing people to change the default is another good use case for this type of preset, rather than it being baked into the code base where it requires releases, code changes and releasing. Having just an object that allows people to change it per their environment would be useful. But yeah, issuers kind of do what they want. Is that the right way to say it? Yeah, they can overrule you. But so this is kind of just a developer workflow improvement. Can't remember what the right term is there. Quality of life improvement. That was the term. Yeah.
Okay. But for example, like things like email addresses or common name, those are things that you can, I guess, skip in your certificate request and still add in the certificate itself when you have like a custom implementation of an issuer.
So I put them down as things that you probably wouldn't default, on the basis that they're probably quite custom to the certificate in question, in that you don't need all them fields apart from secret name, but secret name is a bit of like a bit of a separate case. But you know, URIs, subject, IP address, email, DNS, common name, like, you know, you have to set something for your certificate. You can't just, you know, do nothing, I think. I'm willing to be wrong on that. If I can do nothing and get my certificate, then you tell me. But yeah, I think I ruled those fields out on that basis and kind of focused on all the other fields listed here. So, you know, things like the duration, key stores, private key stuff, the renew settings, history limits, usages maybe, that sort of thing. And I tried to pull out what I think are the defaults that are set in cert-manager in here as well, so for reference. But they may or may not be right. I tried but didn't look over everything.
I mean, you're definitely right about like private key configuration and like secret name, those kind of things you cannot default on the issuer side, right? Those things have to be specified in your certificate resource. If it makes sense, like there's no way to implement an issuer that changes the private key type.
Because cert-manager has already generated the private key to generate the CSR before it gets the issue. Yeah, you can't. Yeah, so an ability to set that, at least that value is definitely worthwhile. But you could argue that everything else, the issuer will just default, and maybe those fields aren't useful to default. But I think it would be nice for people to have defaults that match their issuer. As a user, I'd imagine, you know, a platform person would set up, say they've got one cluster issuer, they'd probably set up one preset object which defaults most of this stuff to what their organization wants. A tenant would just come along and fill in a DNS name and a CB, and then they don't really care about the rest of the fields per se. Like the workflow I've observed in the past is, you know, you specify something and then you go, oh, I need to do the private key rotation. So then they have to go find, they have some error, they have to go find the error, find the config, input it, do it again, find they've got something else that doesn't quite match, do it again. It's try and make that experience nicer.
Could you like create a Helm chart that just has all these defaults in it?
You could.
My certificate Helm chart.
You could. Depends on the organizations. You know, some platform teams will do that and be quite happy. Other platform teams will say that certificate is not my concern. My concern is that it gets generated and put in the cluster, but you know, the actual configuration and stuff is between the tenant and my issuer or team who manages the issuer. So yes, you absolutely could solve this with just a Helm template. Or you could solve some of it, because you still wouldn't be able to change cert-manager defaults if you had a Helm template. You'd only change the actual certificate object. You wouldn't, like, cert-manager would still have defaults that, if not specified, would do something like a nil revision history limit, for example, is a default. So I'm talking like I know a lot about this, but I've spent the last week or so just kind of delving into it. But I think it's a valuable potential feature.
Do you think the defaulting should mutate the certificate? I do. I would like a defaulting webhook, which, if I don't specify the revision history limit and I apply a certificate, the certificate I get back has all of the defaults very clearly set. I think that's what I want. What do you think, Peter? Because I think you want to be able to change the defaults sometime in the future, don't you? You want to be able to go to the preset and change the revision history limit and have it automatically applied to all the certificates.
Not necessarily auto-applied, because that would be, you know, finding all the certificates and making renew. And I think you can just do a CM CTL renew and, you know, pass on to flags if you really want to do it that way. But I'm also thinking like the GitOps pattern. If you mutate it, is that going to cause people's workflows to be out of sync when they've got things that auto sync? I would certainly like to see it in the certificate resource as like at least that something had been defaulted, or like it's the status, like these fields have been defaulted to this. Would be nice to see as an end user. It's like I didn't have to specify them, but I know what they are. They're easy to find. I don't have to kind of.
On the other hand, though, we're trying not to baffle the application team with all of these unnecessary details, aren't we? So that's the other side. The other side is if we mutate the certificate, and suddenly the certificate they submitted has all of these extra fields which they have no understanding of, that's detrimental.
But what do we do? Maybe this is a good question. What do we do currently? I think my understanding is that we ask the issuer what it should look like, and then generate a CSR that sort of looks like that, might fill in some defaults. Like, we try to make it look like that, do we? Or do we just kind of take whatever the values are plus the default ones and generate a CSR and be done with it?
I don't think I understand the question.
If I used Venafi issuer as an example, I think we make a call to the issuer to say, what do you expect the CSR to look like? And then we try to generate a CSR that sort of matches that. I don't know if we do this with other issuers or not.
I don't think we do. I
Do we not?
don't think we do that. No. The Venafi server might add or ignore some of the CSR fields and give us a certificate with different values, but cert-manager doesn't try and doesn't try and match the certificate request.
So we just generate a CSR based on whatever the user gives us plus whatever defaults we have,
Yeah,
and then send it. So coming back to the webhook thing, yes and no. As in, yes, it might be a good case. If you do that if you do it as a webhook, why wouldn't people just do it with Caverno or OPA or something that does this already? And it adds an extra kind of, if that thing fails, you stop getting certificates. But then again, I'm not likely to be the one implementing this. So
that's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I've never done that with Caverno. If it's possible to do that could be the first step, couldn't it? We could write some documentation saying, if you want to set some sane defaults, you could do it this way with Caverno. See how it pans out, and if it's not sufficient, then we could do something extra. There's already a webhook. I mean, if we added a defaulting webhook to cert-manager, we wouldn't be adding any extra like round trip or anything, I don't think.
I think it's slightly tangential, but with Kubernetes 128, there's the feature around not replacing webhooks, but doing some of that logic in the API through CEL. So yeah, if it was that sort of pattern, I think in the future we might look at doing it slightly differently anyway. But okay, maybe that's an action I can take away as to, let's do some Caverno example.
Yeah, I think that'd be pretty cool.
I agree that would be cool. It's a sort of a lightweight, low code like approach to it. Because I'm running quite low on time, it's a bit of a change of subject almost, but under the proposed solutions, when we previously discussed how this might be done, I had some reservations about the modifying the issuer objects. My only sort of evolved thought since then is that I don't think we should change any of the issuer CRDs that we have, for the reason that it would be very difficult for external issuers to incorporate those kinds of changes. Like, I don't think the certificate preset field should be added to our issuer CRDs.
Yes,
you have it there, of course. I just, I'm reiterating what I said before, but I think I've convinced myself of it now, whereas last time I was wondering about it.
Yeah, and you saying that made me kind of think, actually, that kind of makes sense. It's much easier to And if we introduce this but didn't want it in the future, it's much easier to take out an entire CRD than it is to try and take out a field in a existing CRD. Yeah. So I added it to risks, and I also updated it back to being its own CRD in both cases actually, because
Yeah,
I didn't like the annotation idea either in my head.
fair play. Yeah, I mean, like all of that said, like this looks fantastic, and like kudos to you for doing this. It's really good.
Thank you. So
But
I
then
didn't
for
want to
the,
make.
oh sorry,
No, go on.
I feel like like if you look at issuers, the subject and the like those kind of attributes, those would be interesting for issuers that are like the CA issuer and the self-signed issuer. Not so much for the Vault and the Venafi issuer, I would say. Like the CA issuer could, for example, default the subject organization to my company. And so you could request a certificate that doesn't have like a subject in it, and still it would have this my company field in it. So I was wondering, maybe it kind of makes sense for that, but then like defaulting private key stuff in there, that doesn't make sense at all, I think. Like the private key settings, because that's technically, I think that's not even possible, because currently we don't look at the issuer objects at that point in the process. So basically what we do is for generating a certificate request resource, we only look at the certificates resource. And then the issuers only look at certificate request resources, so they don't look at certificate resources. So it's like a two-step process, basically. So private key information is only in this first step that it's useful, because what cert-manager does, the cert-manager controller, it looks at the certificate resource, sees this private key configuration, and then based on that, it generates a private key, puts it in a secret, and then generates the certificate request, and puts in the CSR signed with this private key in that certificate request resource. So the issuer only looks at the generated CSR resource, the signed CSR resource, and creates a certificate based on that. That certificate can contain any kind of information. Like it doesn't really depend on what is in the CSR. Well, it should kind of depend on it, right? But it depends on what the issuer actually does in its logic. Could just generate a random certificate with a totally different subject or domain name. What it should do, I think, one of the checks that we have is that it should be signed with the same private key used to sign the CSR. Like that's kind of, those are kind of elementary things that we do rely on. Does that make sense, right?
Depending on the issuer type, there is different logic around how something's generated before it's sent off to be issued, before the CSR is sent to an issuer. Is that's what you're saying?
No, I think it's like, it's always the same. Like the CSR sent to the issuer is always the same. It's just how the issuer handles that CSR, that's different. And so the issuer applies defaulting after it receives the CSR. So it receives a CSR without a subject in it. What it will do, it will create a certificate and it will put a subject in it, a default subject.
Right. Yeah.
What define issuer though? Are you talking about the Vault server, for example, not the Vault issuer?
Okay.
Controller in cert-manager, right?
I'm talking about the controller in cert-manager, right? I think Peter might be talking about something else.
Oh, I thought you were talking. I mistook. Are you sure? So that are you saying, Tim, that the Vault issuer, sorry, the Vault certificate request reconciler in cert-manager sets a default subject, sets some default subject fields. How can it do
Well,
that?
I guess no. It's not, kind of depends, because the Venafi issuer does that.
Which issue are we talking about? The reconcile, the Go
the
code?
The Venafi controller does that. Like the Venafi issuer controller does that. Like it fetches the policy from the Venafi control plane and then applies the defaults from the policy to the certificates.
How can it do that? It can't modify the CSR, can it?
No, but I don't think the Venafi API actually requires the CSR to be signed still. You can just, because you're authenticated already against the Venafi API, you can just send it the certificate details, I think.
Well,
you can
that's
even
a surprise to me.
provide it
I didn't realize. We should double check that. I don't think
There's-
you're right.
Yeah, no. I guess there are some defaults that can be applied. Maybe it's not CSR that's modified.
It's stuff outside of the CSR, isn't it? It's like, which certificate authority do you want to sign this thing, or which you can override the duration, duration, or things like that, which aren't in the CSR.
Yeah, well, there's this update certificate request function there, right? That says apply default values from Venafi zone. So kind of depends on what that function does.
This is what I was thinking about before when I said we read the Venafi policy or zone and then do something to the request to make it try to match. But I only know this specifically for Venafi. I haven't looked at, like, say, the Vault issuer to see if we do a similar thing.
But I feel it doesn't really matter in this conversation. I think we can just consider both the controller and the actual, like, Venafi or Vault instance. We can consider that the same, I think. That's just the issuer. So we have internal issuers, and then, like, part of that issuer is inside of the cert-manager controller, and part of it is in the Venafi instance. But we also have external issuers, where the issue is fully external from the cert-manager.
Yeah, I think we can scope this conversation to say that, like, we're not going to change anything about how the issuer issues the certificate. All we're doing is trying to provide default values to the certificate resource so the user doesn't have to specify them. We're not changing any of the logic after that point. But those default values might change the CSR, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, like, if you default the private key to something bigger than what cert-manager does, which might currently be 2048 for an RSA key, you default it to 4096, you'll get that will happen. But yeah, you could still get back, you could set the default subject to be, my company, and you could get it back to be Dave's company or something like that. And that's still going to happen.
Yeah. But then, I guess, to my point, I was wondering how useful is defaulting, for example, for subjects, if you can already configure that in your issuer itself. Right? Why do you have to default it before sending it to the issuer if the issuer can do the defaulting itself? For example, for subject, like for private key key size, that is different. Because there it's not the issuer that decides.
Good point.
So if we keep talking about Venafi, you can have a policy in Venafi that says any certificate request received by TPP must have the organization field set. And so you would want, in that case, to set a default somehow for that organization. And you wouldn't want the application team to have to choose that, perhaps.
But I mean, in your TPP instance, in this example, you could just change it so it doesn't require you to that field to be set. It can just automatically set it.
So overrides it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think I see what you're saying, Tim. Shall we think carefully about which fields really need to be defaulted and which don't, and perhaps start with a small set of really important fields which are genuinely where it would undoubtedly be useful to be able to default them.
Yeah. I'm just saying, like, let's not overcomplicate this and add a lot of features that, like, if you can already configure something in a place, let's not add another place to configure it, because that will complicate stuff. Like, if we have two defaulting mechanisms at two different places, that will make things more complex, I think.
Yes, because the other or I should add this to the potential solutions, but something like p size, you could add a command line flag to default it, which we do for something like the ingress shim default issuer. There's a command line flag for that. I mean, I don't love the idea of adding more command line flags, but I'm not. If we want to set, I don't really care, I guess. But I prefer something neater. But that is an option. So if there's only like 3 things that actually we care about setting, we can do it as a command line. The caveat is that is once per install, and so that would be useful for people who control, like, who manage a cluster. But it might not be so useful for people who don't control a cluster and, in their tenant namespace want to just default things to what they think they should be, not what the platform team thinks it should be.
It would be a bit like a sort of nested config, like Git. You have your global config and you have your per subdirectory config, where you can override certain things. The command line flag should ultimately go away when the configuration file feature is rolled out, right? So you could imagine that the defaults could be put into the configuration file, and they could be automatically reloaded by cert-manager when the config map changes. And you could have a config map in each namespace which overrode, which cert-manager would look for and use those settings. Maybe?
That sounds sounds kind of crazy, but yeah, it sounds kind of cool. I mean, I've been recently looking at these config map things, and so it's planned, like, it's merged already for the controller now. So all the controller configuration flags are now configurable through config map, and that will be released in the next release. So that's 1.13. The thing about, like, dynamically changing these things and, like, reloading the control because of that, and then having these config maps into having them, like, per namespace, that's pretty interesting, I think, Richard. Pretty cool idea, but
I don't know. That's just like, you could imagine something like that.
Yeah,
you could also imagine just having, like, a certificate is the presets. You just choose you put a certificate in the cluster and say this is designated as the preset. And so if someone else creates a certificate where the values aren't set, it grabs the defaults from this prototype certificate. You don't need a different resource. You don't need a preset resource. That would be a hack. That would be a hack.
Wouldn't be as clean, I think. Yeah.
But also, what about? I mean, we're only talking about certificates. What about CSI driver and CMCTL? How does one provide defaults for those services?
I mean, CSI driver, you create a different flavor of CSI drive, right? You create your CSI driver spiffy or something like that.
No, but I mean, if you're an organization and you want the default key type to be ECDSA, and you want that to apply to certificates, CSI drivers, CMCTL, how is it? Could we achieve that? Like some sort of default mechanism which also is used by CSI driver.
I feel right now we just create a new CSI driver. That's how it's done right now.
As someone who isn't likely to be able to do that very quickly, to change a default value, if the option is to go and write your own CSI driver, even based off a template, that's quite a lot of work. I mean,
I don't really mean it like that. I don't say. I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm kind of saying that it might be something we kind of do with CSI drive Spiffy, although Spiffy has some other features too, right?
I don't understand what's it got to do with the implementation of the CSI. Why is it? I must confess I haven't used CSI driver, but how do you configure the rotation period for a CSI driver certificate? I thought it was like a field in the volume mount or something like that.
Maybe. I mean, for CSI driver, there's no certificate resource, right? So it's only certificate request. So
But
the rotation is fully managed.
Can't you
fully
control
managed by
how
the CSI driver. So I guess it could be a flag on the CSI driver itself, or it could be a configuration in the.
Or for that matter, how do you configure the private key algorithm?
I guess that is probably like an option in the CSI driver mount configuration. But it could be a flag too, like I would have to look for that.
Right. And you could put, if it's configurable through like the volume mount spec, then maybe you could default those things using Caverno as well.
Yeah.
I'd been, yeah, I haven't got anything else to say. I'm interested in the Caverno thing because I could imagine adding something about that to the best practices page on the cert-manager site as an interim solution.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So you would add like a mutating webhook thing for pods, basically, right?
Yeah.
A kernel rule for pods that like default some of the values, or maybe just override them.
Yeah.
And the same for certificate resources.
Comes back to that question that Peter asked. I don't know what, like, if you have all these defaulting mechanisms, how does that confuse Flux and Argo? It's created a resource, but the resource in the API server is different to what it submitted.
I mean, surely Argo must be able to handle that, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about Flux, but I know in Argo you can handle this by. This is really roundabout when you say it like this. But if you've got a mutating webhook that changes something that a user didn't set, it will show as out of sync unless you ignore the field that it's setting, which kind of, to me, defeats the whole point of having a GitOps that kind of set it. Like, which is why I don't really like.
Because you almost want the defaults that have been applied by the mutating webhook need to be committed back into the GitOps system, so that if you repeat the deployment, you get exactly what you previously deployed, rather than what happens to be the current configuration of the mutating webhook.
Yeah, because unless there's a better way, that tends to be what happens. Like a very silly example might be that you in a Helm chart, you specify replicas so that install time you have like at least one replica or something, but you actually want to scale it up. So in the future, you will then ignore that value of replicas because it's going to change quite regularly. Or if you've got an HPA, you would not set it because you've got an HPA that controls it. And then that doesn't interfere with the GitOps because HPA sort of controls that value, and so you see that way. But yeah, it just seems it seems odd. This is getting way off topic, but it does seem odd that you would have something set in GitOps and use GitOps to deploy it only to then ignore it because something else mutates it in your cluster, but might not mutate it in a different cluster that you apply it to, depending on who manages the policy settings. But yeah, I'll do some Kubernetes examples just because I think they're a little bit easier than OPA in my opinion. But yeah, it's relatively easy to say mutate this value in a field when on this type of resource. So you could set this, on a certificate resource, for example, and say mutate this thing to be that. Or you can obviously not do mutate, you could validate it. And I think you can provide a useful feedback to the user to say, we think this should be this, but or something like that. Okay, let me put that as an action anyway out of this, that we do some
how does the CEL defaulting work? Is that another thing to investigate? Is the idea that we the cert-manager maintainers provide some CEL defaults, but the end user could change the defaults to match their needs somehow?
I had only one use case where I thought CL might be nice, in that when you basically, whenever I do a certificate object, my secret name, I'm looking for like where it's set now. Anyway, the secret name I always put
from the
exactly
certificate name,
which is where maybe CEL could go get object.name or metadata name and then do some random string at the end and that. But to include CEL just for that one field seems a little bit silly, but I arguably don't care what the secret name is as long as it doesn't clash with anything. But how is CEL gonna know that unless you can also get the context of the namespace and stuff? So but anyway, yeah.
It's also a pretty new feature, right, to support CL in these admission webhooks. I think it's only the latest, like it hasn't been released yet, or
yes, this is. I think it's this for admission control. I was looking at the 128 release stuff. Yes, so it's going to be new, so it'll be like probably not something a lot of users will be using straight away. Let's put it that way. But I think we should probably keep one eye on it, because if it becomes mainstream, it might make sense to adopt. Plus, Tim is an expert in CEL, so
I don't know about that.
Okay. Did you want to mention the configuration stuff, Tim? Just because that seemed quite interesting relating to this topic. I made a note here, but I don't know if you had a PR I could link to kind of say this is coming.
Yes, sure. There are several PRs, and it's like not me who has done most of the work. It's Cody. Let me actually see what his last name is, because I forgot. Let me quickly. I'll post it in chat here. This is the PR. It's Cody Eiler, who basically created this PR to support loading control configuration from a versioned file. And what that does is it adds support for these config files, in which you can specify all the configuration that you would normally specify through CLI flags. So it's pretty cool. This is the first PR. Then I created kind of a PR on top of that to restructure because what Cody did, he took the flags and then he put it in the configuration file. I thought we could actually kind of group some of the flags together in the configuration file and create like subgroups, so it's a bit easier to understand. And that was also how it was done in the webhook config file. So we already have a webhook config file. But now we'll have one for the controller too, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, that's the PR, so that got merged too. And there are some other PRs. One of them is to actually move the logging configuration. So the logs in the webhook currently are only configurable through the CLI. I think that's my mistake. I added that only in CLI because I didn't understand how the config file stuff worked. But Cody figured out that you can actually also configure that through the config file. So I tried to do that just like he did for the webhook too. That's another PR. And then there is one more PR to kind of clean up some of this loading code, because it's pretty complex if you look at it. Like, first you parse all the flags to get like the flag that contains the config file name. Then you load the config from that config file. And then you override again using the flags, because the flags have to be like they have to come first before you. So the flags will override what's in the config file. So if you say my Kubernetes, my kubeconfig file is on this location through a flag, that will override what is configured in the config file. So you kind of have to parse the flags twice, because first you have to parse it to get the config file location, and then you have to parse it again to override what is in the config file, actually.
Yeah, and then you could still specify a command line flag to override something that's in the config file as well. Maybe. Sorry, I'm understanding there's an order of inheritance here, as in there'll be a default value, then you can set it in a config file, which would be the right place to set it now with the new feature. But config command line flags will also still be there, so that could also set the same value and override the thing. Yeah,
indeed.
Right.
Just that the implementation is a bit complex, because you have to parse the config flags twice. You have to parse it once the first time to get the location of the config file, and then you have to parse it again to override what's in the config file, basically.
Got you. Yeah, so you could load the config file anywhere, assuming you passed in the right flag to say where it was. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, you got to read the flags to then reread them afterwards. Okay.
And there's
ultimately all the flags will be deprecated. There will just be --config. That will be the only flag to cert-manager.
Maybe. If you respond to all the people who do not agree with that, then it's okay for me that you can make the change, because that will be massively breaking, I think.
It'd be really neat.
It would be neat, yeah. Although I think config flags are also quite cool. Like, I don't want to create a file often. Often I just want to specify through a config flag.
Yeah. Did you so running out of time, aren't we? So I'll leave my question for another time, Tim, when we're chatting. I was just had an idea.
One thing I was really into this config file thing a while back, and it was documented in the Cube Builder book. But then recently I noticed they've deprecated it all, and I haven't really dug into the reasons for that. So
okay.
we have to be careful. We're going to not just be implementing something which is about to be removed from controller runtime. I think maybe there's an alternative.
I mean, I don't think we're using component config or whatever that is.
I'm just interested to know why that. I couldn't understand why they deprecated it. Did they find that this config file approach was fundamentally flawed in some way, or?
There is an issue. Oh no, unable to still use. I don't know. Or isn't this like something else? Component config?
I'm not sure. I think it's basically the same thing.
Okay.
In that case, I'll move very quickly along to the final topic that I also added as well. I was just going to ask if people found the Slack reminder helpful in Slack for this meeting. But there's not that many of us here, so it's probably not a good sample size. But I was just wondering if you wanted to have more reminders other than just the start of the day, because I got the reminder at the start of the day, but I also completely sort of halfway through the day forget, and then would appreciate like a follow-up reminder, like 1 hour until cert-manager meeting or something like that. I didn't know if that was a good idea or a bad idea, or if people hated Slack notifications, which, in case.
I quite like it. I like it. You came through at 10 a.m. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say they're a really good idea. But sometimes if you have something that's just slightly complicated, like, something that happens every other week on a Thursday, it can be quite tricky to get it right. So I will apologize for all the random. Someone set up a reminder that ultimately got deleted because I typed it wrong.
I like the link to the Google Meet. That's really useful. Actually, I forgot about the reminder though. I had to go to my calendar and find it there. Is there any way to prevent it from adding that preview of googlemeet.com real-time meetings by Google? That seems a bit redundant.
Yeah, I clicked it off and I set the reminder, but I guess it auto does it. So unless there's like some Slack syntax to not do that, then
Right. No, I think it's useful. Thanks for doing it. Oh, someone's added a bookmark as well. The Slack bookmarks I've been using quite a lot in Venafi channels, and I find those very useful.
How does that work? Isn't that like to remember something?
It shows up for everyone, right? So at the top of the cert-manager dev channel, there's a bookmark to the bi-weekly meeting notes. And you could add more. You could add links to the source code and the latest release.
Oh, okay. I see.
contributor guidelines or something. I don't know.
Because you also have like the save for later feature in Slack, but that is, I guess, not a bookmark. Kind of
That's
looks
a
like
personal thing. That's just for you, whereas the bookmarks show up for everyone.
But the icon is also like a bookmark icon.
Oh, right. I've never used that feature.
And yeah,
to me.
It's like you've personally bookmarked it rather than channel bookmarked it.
Okay.
Cool. And that was all the topics on the agenda. Should we stop there? Just 1 minute over and stop recording?
Yeah, I've got to go. Thanks. Interesting.